Welcome to Empathy Stories, where every tale reminds us of the quiet strength within us and the importance of kindness in an often unkind world. Today's story takes us to a lavish party where one young woman's dignity is tested, only to discover that true power lies in resilience and compassion. The sun dipped low in the sky, turning its golden light into soft amber as it brushed over Lexington Heights. The grand estate perched on a hillside overlooking the city. The mansion was the embodiment of wealth, a sprawling masterpiece of stone and glass, with columns that seemed to scrape the sky and windows that gleamed like polished mirrors. Below, the infinity pool stretched out like a sheet of liquid sapphire, its edge blurring seamlessly into the horizon. Around it, the evening unfolded in perfect harmony, a scene that whispered luxury in every detail. The guests had arrived in droves, dressed to impress. Men in tailored suits stood in clusters, their hands wrapped around crystal flutes of champagne, laughing with the ease of men who knew no hardship. Women draped in silk and chiffon, their jewelry catching the dying sunlight, glided across the deck as if they owned the very ground they walked on. Soft jazz, played by a live quartet, wove through the conversation like a delicate thread, tying the scene together in elegance. This was a night that celebrated extravagance, a place where problems of the world seemed to vanish, at least for those who belonged. Among the invisible players of the evening was Anna. She wasn't dressed in chiffon or silk. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt, black trousers, and a neatly tied apron, marked her as staff, someone who served rather than celebrated. But to Anna, the uniform meant far more than a job. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of her resolve to keep going. At 23 years old, Anna carried a quiet strength that came from living through challenges that most of the guests here couldn't fathom. Her father had passed when she was a teenager, leaving her family in disarray. Her mother, though strong at heart, had fallen ill the previous year, and the burden of caring for her family had fallen squarely on Anna's shoulders. She'd left college without hesitation, trading her dreams for long hours and late nights. Her younger brother, Jake, still had a shot at life, a chance to do better. She wouldn't let anything take that away. Tonight, Anna's task was simple: move through the crowd unseen, offering glasses of champagne and trays of hors d'oeuvres with precision and grace. Blend in, stay invisible. The world of the wealthy always felt foreign to Anna, as if she'd stepped onto the stage of a play where everyone else knew their lines, but she had been handed the wrong script. Their laughter was light and carefree, their conversations meaningless to someone who counted every penny she earned. Yet Anna never let it show. She moved across the deck with practiced poise, her expression neutral but polite, her tray balanced as if it were a natural extension of her hand. Near the pool's edge, a group of younger guests had gathered. They were louder than the others, their laughter punctuated by occasional shouts of amusement. At the center of it all was Chad. Chad was everything Anna disliked in a person: arrogant, entitled, and careless with the feelings of others. He was the kind of man who had been given everything in life, but valued nothing. Even the suit he wore, tailored to perfection, seemed wasted on someone whose charm was as empty as the champagne glasses Anna carried. His loud voice carried over the sound of the music, drawing attention to himself as he spun exaggerated stories to his friends, gesturing with the kind of theatricality that made him impossible to ignore. Anna approached the group cautiously, her tray held steady. "Champagne?" she asked politely, her voice soft but clear. Most of the group ignored her, too absorbed in their laughter to care. But Chad's attention turned to her instantly. His gaze swept over her, not with kindness or curiosity, but with the smirk of someone who saw himself as better. Anna's stomach tightened, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with people like him before. "Careful there, Cinderella," Chad said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. Laughter erupted from the group, sharp and cruel. Anna's cheeks flushed, but she didn't falter. She turned to move away, knowing that silence was often the best shield. But Chad wasn't finished. "Hey, everyone," he called. Louder now, his voice ringing across the deck. Want to see something funny? Before Anna could process his words, Chad moved. In one swift motion, he stepped behind her and gave her a deliberate shove. The world seemed to slow in that instant. The tray tilted, champagne flutes slipping from her grasp and scattering like shimmering stars. Then, the cold shock of the pool hit her, water enveloping her in a silence that muffled the world above. When Anna surfaced, gasping for breath, the sound of laughter hit her like a slap. It was louder now, crueler. The guests watched, their faces lit with amusement. For them, this was entertainment, a moment they would joke about later, their laughter drowning out the pain it caused. Chad stood smugly at the edge of the pool, his grin wide as if he had done something clever. Come on, it's just water, he called, his voice carrying over the crowd. Anna bit the inside of her cheek to keep the tears at bay. She could feel her soaked clothes clinging to her, the weight of the humiliation sinking deeper than the water. But she didn't cry. Crying would give them power. Slowly, she pulled herself out of the pool, trembling from the cold. Her soaked shoes squeaked against the tiles as she knelt to pick up the shattered glass. Her hands steadied despite the way they shook. Around her, the laughter continued, growing louder like a tide she couldn't stop. She wanted to scream, to tell them all how heartless they were. But she didn't. Instead, she thought of her mother, resting at home, and Jake, hunched over his books as he studied. Her sacrifices were for them. This moment, this pain, wouldn't break her. Somewhere behind her, the music resumed, and the laughter began to fade. For the guests, the spectacle was over. For Anna, it was another reminder of the world she lived in, a world where kindness was rare and cruelty wore a smiling face. She gathered the broken glass carefully, one shard at a time, her resolve hardening like stone. Whatever pain she felt now would only make her stronger. And then, as if on cue, a hush fell over the crowd. Footsteps echoed across the deck, a presence cutting through the noise like a blade. Anna paused, her heart pounding. She didn't dare look up, but she knew something had changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tension so thick it felt as though the night itself held its breath. The host had arrived. Mr. Grant, the man whose name commanded attention, had finally stepped onto the scene. Mr. Grant's arrival felt like a sudden change in the wind. The quiet that followed his steps was deafening, and even the soft strains of jazz seemed to falter as if the music itself sensed his presence. He walked with a kind of authority that didn't need words to command respect. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and the sharp lines of his tailored suit only added to his air of dignified power. His piercing blue eyes swept across the pool deck. Missing nothing, Anna could feel him before she saw him, the weight of his presence pressing against her shoulders as she knelt beside the shards of broken glass. She kept her head down, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the last piece onto the tray. Her soaked uniform clung to her like a second skin, and the puddle around her felt colder now that the night had grown still. What happened here? Mr. Grant's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't raised, but it carried a firmness that demanded an answer. Anna dared a glance upward, her breath catching when she met his eyes. They were sharp but not unkind, searching the scene before him with keen understanding. The crowd shifted uneasily, their earlier amusement now replaced with discomfort. Chad, however, stood by the pool's edge, his smugness not entirely erased. He straightened his jacket and gave a forced chuckle. It was nothing, Chad said, waving a dismissive hand. The waitress tripped in. Is that true? Mr. Grant's gaze turned to Anna, cutting Chad off mid-sentence. Anna froze, her mind racing. Her instinct was to stay silent, to avoid making things worse. People like Chad, people with power and money, always seemed untouchable, while people like her had no voice. But something in Mr. Grant's expression gave her pause. It was as if he were offering her a choice, a chance to speak her truth. Her voice wavered, but she spoke. No, sir, she said quietly, but firmly. I didn't trip. He pushed me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. soft gasps escaping from the guests, who now watched the scene unfold with rapt attention. Mr. Grant's expression darkened, his jaw tightening just enough to show his displeasure. "Is that so?" he said, turning his attention back to Chad. Chad's smug grin faltered. "It was just a joke," he protested, though his voice was less confident now. "Come on, it's just water. She's fine." Mr. Grant's gaze was ice cold. "Did you find it funny?" Chad opened his mouth to reply, but faltered, glancing nervously at the other guests. None of them laughed now. The earlier amusement that had fed his arrogance had vanished, replaced by silent shame. "Let me be very clear," Mr. Grant said, his voice low, but cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is my home, and I will not tolerate cruelty disguised as humor. If you find entertainment in humiliating others, you do not belong here." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Chad stammered, trying to salvage his pride. "I didn't mean—" "You're leaving. Now." Mr. Grant gestured subtly, and almost immediately, two security guards appeared, as if they had been waiting for his signal. Chad looked around in disbelief, his face red with embarrassment as the guards flanked him. "You can't be serious," Chad exclaimed, his voice rising. "I'm quite serious." Mr. Grant's tone didn't waver. "Good night, Chad." There was no further argument. The guards led Chad away, his protests fading into the background as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Anna remained frozen where she knelt, her fingers still clutching the tray of broken glass. She could hardly believe what had just happened. When Chad was gone, Mr. Grant turned back to Anna, stepping forward until he was standing just a few feet from her. His expression softened, the cold edge gone from his voice. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Anna blinked up at him, unable to hide her surprise at the question. No one had ever asked her that before, not in this kind of place. Not when she was just the help. She nodded quickly, her voice small. "Yes, sir. I'm fine." Mr. Grant didn't look convinced. His gaze fell to the tray she still held in her hands, and he knelt beside her, his perfectly tailored trousers brushing the damp tile. "You don't need to clean this up," he said softly. "You've done enough." Anna hesitated, the instinct to refuse rising within her. "But it's my job," she murmured. "Not tonight," Mr. Grant replied firmly. He gestured to a nearby server, who quickly stepped in to take the tray from her hands. Anna sat back on her heels, feeling a strange sense of relief as the weight of the glass was lifted. "Stand up," Mr. Grant said, offering his hand. Anna stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. No one had ever offered her their hand before, not like this. But there was something genuine in his expression, something kind. Slowly, she reached out, and he helped her to her feet. Her clothes were still soaked, her hair clinging to her face. But for the first time that night, she didn't feel invisible. The crowd still watched in silence, their gazes heavy with discomfort and guilt. Anna felt their eyes, but she focused on Mr. Grant. "You mentioned that this wasn't an accident," he said, his voice still gentle. "That you were pushed. I appreciate your honesty, but I'd like to ask you something else." Anna frowned slightly, confused. "Yes, sir." Mr. Grant studied her for a moment, his piercing gaze softening. "Why are you here? Working so hard under these kinds of circumstances? What drives you to keep going?" Anna's heart skipped a beat at the question. She had never been asked to explain herself, to share the reasons behind the life she lived. Her gaze dropped for a moment, her fingers nervously brushing against her apron. But when she looked back at Mr. Grant, his expression was kind, encouraging. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. "My family," she said simply. "My mom is sick, and my little brother is still in school. Someone has to take care of them. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they're okay. That's why I'm here." Her voice didn't falter, though the words came from a place deep within her heart. Around them, the crowd was silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a blanket. Anna didn't care what they thought. She had spoken the truth. And for once, it felt like someone was listening. Mr. Grant nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You remind me of someone I knew," he said softly, almost to himself. Then, looking back at the crowd, he addressed them with a tone of quiet authority. What you've witnessed here tonight is more than just cruelty. It's a failure to recognize the dignity of another human being. Anna's story is one of strength and resilience, something all of us could learn from. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter now a distant, shameful memory. Anna felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment this time, but with an odd mix of pride and gratitude. Then Mr. Grant turned back to her, his expression kind. "But I think you've endured enough for one evening," he said. "I'd like to make you an offer." Anna's breath caught in her throat. "An offer?" she repeated softly. "Yes," he replied, "but we'll discuss that soon." For the first time that night, Anna felt the faintest spark of hope. The silence that lingered over the pool deck was almost tangible, as if the air itself had thickened under the weight of everything that had just happened. Mr. Grant stood tall beside Anna, his quiet authority still rippling through the crowd. The guests, who just moments ago had been laughing and jeering, now shifted uncomfortably, their shame visible in their downcast eyes and hushed whispers. Anna stood soaked to the bone, her uniform still clinging to her as the cool night breeze swept across the deck. She wasn't shivering from the cold anymore, though it was something else, a mix of confusion, relief, and the lingering sting of humiliation. She couldn't quite process what had just happened. Mr. Grant had defended her, not out of pity, but with a sincerity that had been missing from every interaction she'd had in this world of excess and entitlement. He turned back to her, his expression softening as the edges of his mouth curved into the faintest of smiles. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm but firm, as though this wasn't a request but a natural next step. Anna hesitated. She glanced at the crowd, the sea of faces that now regarded her with curiosity rather than scorn. Her instinct told her to stay invisible, to shrink back into the role she'd learned to play so well. But something in Mr. Grant's tone, in the steadiness of his gaze, made her trust him. Slowly, she nodded as she followed him across the pool deck. The chatter of the guests began to rise again, though this time the tone was different. Whispers of surprise, speculation, and, perhaps, regret. Mr. Grant led Anna toward the house, the soft glow of its lights spilling onto the manicured lawn. When they reached a small, private seating area just outside the mansion, he gestured for her to sit on one of the cushioned chairs. "Wait here for a moment," he said kindly. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the house, leaving Anna alone to process everything. The quiet of the garden was almost unnerving after the chaos she'd just endured. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their faint fragrance mixing with the lingering scent of chlorine from the pool. Anna leaned back slightly, her body exhausted, but her mind racing. What could he possibly want from her? Why did someone like Mr. Grant, a man whose wealth and power placed him leagues above her, care about what had happened? Her thoughts were interrupted when Mr. Grant returned, this time carrying a folded towel and a steaming mug. "Here," he said, handing her the towel first. "You're still freezing." Anna blinked in surprise, but took the towel, murmuring a soft, "Thank you." "And this," he added, handing her the mug. "It's tea. It'll warm you up." She accepted the tea, cradling the mug between her hands as its warmth spread through her fingers. The kindness in these simple gestures almost overwhelmed her, stirring something deep inside, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Mr. Grant sat across from her, studying her quietly for a moment before speaking. "You're stronger than most people here tonight. You know," he said finally. Anna looked up at him, startled. "Me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Yes, you. Most people would have crumbled under the weight of that humiliation. But you didn't. You held your head high and did what needed to be done. That takes more strength than you realize." Anna swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. She'd always thought of her resilience as survival, something she had no choice but to do. Hearing someone call it strength felt foreign, yet strangely comforting. "I didn't want to give them the satisfaction," she admitted softly, staring into the depths of her tea. "I've dealt with people like that before. If you let them see you break, they win." Mr. Grant's expression grew thoughtful. "And you endure all this for your family," he said, more a statement than a question. Anna nodded. "My mom's sick. She needs treatment. And my brother, well, Jake has a chance to go to college, to build a better life. I'm doing this for them. They're the reason I keep going." Her voice held steady, but the weight of her words sat heavy in the air. Mr. Grant leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You remind me of someone," he said after a pause. "My mother." Anna looked up, surprised. "Your mother?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both pain and love. "She wasn't born into this life. She came from nothing, worked herself to the bone to give me the opportunities one had. I wouldn't be where I am today without her sacrifices." Anna listened, her heart softening with every word. For the first time, Mr. Grant didn't seem like a distant billionaire, but a man who understood struggle, who had seen firsthand what it meant to fight for survival. "That's why I created my foundation," he continued, "to help people like my mother, people like you, who refuse to let life's hardships break them." Anna didn't know what to say. The warmth of the tea and the unexpected kindness in Mr. Grant's voice felt surreal, as though she had stepped into someone else's story. Mr. Grant leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind. "I meant what I said earlier. I'd like to offer you something better. A position at one of my charitable organizations. I need people who are strong, who understand hard work and compassion. You have both. If you're willing, I think you'd be a perfect fit." Anna's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "You want me to work for you?" "Yes," Mr. Grant replied simply. "Not as a server or someone who fades into the background, but as part of something bigger. I think you deserve that chance." The words hit her like a wave, overwhelming in their generosity. For years, Anna had fought to keep her family afloat, never daring to hope for more than survival. Now, here was an opportunity, an actual opportunity, to change her life. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll think about it." Mr. Grant said gently, "You don't have to decide tonight." Anna nodded, her voice trembling. "I will. Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." Mr. Grant smiled warmly, and in that moment, Anna felt something shift deep inside her. It wasn't just the humiliation of the night being washed away. It was hope. Hope that her sacrifices might lead to something more. As the sounds of the party faded into the background, Anna knew this night would be a turning point in her life. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that things might truly change. Mr. Grant stood, offering her one last reassuring nod before heading back toward the house. Anna remained seated, the mug of tea warm in her hands and her heart full of emotions she couldn't yet name. She had been pushed down, quite literally, but she had risen, stronger and more determined than ever. Life had taught her that dignity couldn't be taken away unless you gave it up willingly. And tonight, she had held on to it with everything she had. For the first time, Anna let herself smile. This was only the beginning. Thank you for watching today's story on Empathy Stories. If this tale touched your heart, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire kindness, empathy, and reflection. Let's continue spreading messages that remind us to treat others with dignity and respect. See you in the next video.